Hello, team players. So, if you're looking for an archetype that helps you become a great leader, then you should check out the Marshal Archetype. It has great teamwork options, and it also happens to be one of my favorite archetypes. Let's get into it. So, of course, first we gotta start with the dedication. In order to take the martial dedication, you need to be trained in all martial weapons, and you need to be trained in either diplomacy or intimidation. When you pick up this archetype, you choose either diplomacy or intimidation. You become trained in that skill, or an expert if you're already trained. You also get your 10-foot emanation Marshal's Aura. You and all your allies in that aura receive a +1 bonus on saving throws against fear. Your Marshal's Aura also comes into play with certain other martial feats. If you've got high charisma, getting expert in diplomacy or intimidation can help a lot. And the Marshal's Aura comes into play a lot, so keep that in mind. There are quite a few feats from the Martial Archetype you can take at level 4, but first I'm going to go over the 3 stances you can take. Devrin's Cunning Stance, Dread Martial Stance, and Inspiring Martial Stance. In order to enter any of these stances, you need to make a skill check depending on the stance against a standard DC for your level. On a critical success, your Marshal's Aura increases to a 20-foot emanation and you gain the effects of the stance. On a success, you gain the effects of the stance, but your Marshal's Aura does not increase. On a failure, you do not enter the stance. And on a critical failure, you do not enter the stance, and you can't use that stance for the next minute. Devrin's Cunning Stance gives a +1 bonus on skill checks for everyone in your Marshal's Aura. Also, if you or your allies strike an enemy that is off guard, then they can't use reactions until the start of their next turn. This requires a deception check. Dread Martial Stance requires an intimidation check. It gives everyone a status bonus on damage for as long as you're in the stance. Also, if you or an ally critically hit a foe, that foe is frightened 1. With Inspiring Martial Stance, you must make a diplomacy check. This one gives yourself and all allies in your aura a +1 on attack rolls and saves against mental effects. All 3 of these stances are very good. If you're good at all 3 of those skills, then you might take all 3 of these feats. However, for most characters, they're only going to be good at one of these, so you probably only want to take one of these stances. But remember guys, open is no longer a trait, which means you can enter these stances whenever you want. Although it's still probably better to go into these stances before doing anything else, since you are affected by these stances as well. Also remember that Devrin's Cunning Stance has an access requirement. You must be a member of the Firebrands at 2nd mark or higher to take the feats. Assuming, of course, that your GM actually uses access requirement. Next we've got another level 4 feat that has an access requirement. Push Back the Dead. You must be a Knight of Last Wall to take this feat. For one action, choose one ally. That ally gains a +2 bonus on saving throws against effects originating from undead. They also gain resistance to damage from strikes made by undead creatures equal to half your charisma modifier. This one may be a good teamwork option, but it's pretty situational because it only works against undead creatures. So if you're not running into a whole bunch of undead creatures, I would skip this one. Otherwise, this is a great one to pick up. Next we have another great one with Snap Out of It. For one action, you can target one ally who was targeted by a mental effect that allowed a will saving throw. The mental effect can have a duration of no more than 1 minute. That ally immediately gets another will saving throw against the DC of the effect with a +1 circumstance bonus. If successful, the effect ends. This doesn't work on anyone other than your targeted ally. Whether you succeed or fail, that ally is immune to this feat for 10 minutes. This feat can be incredibly useful. Mental effects happen all the time, and most do require a will saving throw from the target. Your allies will love if you have this feat and they get dominated or feared or something like that. And lastly, for level 4, we have Steel Yourself. For one action, choose one ally in your Marshal's Aura. that ally gains temporary hit points equal to your charisma modifier and a +2 bonus on fortitude saving throw. These benefits last until the start of your next turn. Again, this can be extremely useful if you're going up against the right enemies. Your allies will love you when you can help them get over their poison or disease that they have, or anything else that requires a fortitude saving throw. For level 6, we've got Cadence Call. Once per minute for one action, you can give all allies in your Marshal's aura the quickened condition. This lasts until the end of their next turn, but they can only use the extra action to stride. In addition, if they use the extra action, they are slowed 1 until the end of their next turn. This one has a pretty big downside. However, we will be able to take a feat later that will get rid of that downside, as well as make this feat even better. But we'll get to that later. Until you can take that feat, however, I would use this sparingly. Also at level 6, we have Rallying Charge. For 2 actions, you can stride up to your speed and make a melee attack. If you hit and deal damage with this melee attack, then all allies within 60 feet who saw you do this gain temporary hit points equal to your charisma modifier. This temporary HP lasts until the start of your next turn. So not only is this a mini sudden charge for you, it also helps your allies by giving them a little extra hit points. Great feat, highly recommend. We've got a few level 8 feats to talk about. First, let's talk about Reactive Strike. This essentially gives the Reactive Strike fighter ability. So if an enemy performs certain actions in front of you, you get to hit them. I'm not a huge fan of this feat because it's just more damage. But if you get a critical hit on your Reactive Strike, it can disrupt certain actions, which is good for the team. So in the right build, this could be useful. Then we've got Back to Back. As long as you and an ally are adjacent to each other, neither one of you can be off guard due to flanking. Not unless both of you are flanked. If you are adjacent to more than one ally, they all gain this benefit. This feat is negated for everyone if you and at least one of those eligible allies are flanked, but not if your allies are flanked and you aren't. This feat is amazing in small spaces, or if you're facing a lot of tactical enemies. Try combining this with something like the Flesh Warp's Augment Senses. I think you'll be surprised how defensive that makes the party. And then we have To Battle. You can spend 1 or 2 actions on this feat. Choose one ally in your Marshal's aura that has a reaction available. If you spend 1 action on this feat, that ally can use their reaction to stride. If you spend 2 actions, they can use their reaction to immediately strike. Another incredibly useful teamwork feat. Anyone can take advantage of this feat. Spellcasters can use it to get away from enemies, and marshals can use it to hit enemies for damage, as well as, move up if they need to. Whether you spend 1 or 2 actions on this feat is going to depend on the situation and what type of character your ally is playing. Now we're getting into the high-level feats, starting with Topple Foe. As a reaction, if an ally hits with a melee strike against a foe that you are both adjacent to, then you can attempt an athletics check to trip that foe. This is just great action economy, period. And since you're tripping as a reaction, no multiple attack penalty. You obviously need to be trained in athletics to take this feat, but tripping a foe can be incredibly useful, especially since tripping goes off of reflex DC and not fortitude DC like grappling does. Unless you're going up against a foe with high dexterity, such as a flying foe, you're probably better off tripping them than you are grappling them. And this is tripping on your ally's turn. However, remember that it does still take your reaction. So if you do this, no reactive strike. Unless, of course, you have a feat that lets you use more than 1 reaction per turn. Moving on to level 12, we have Coordinated Charge. This is another mini sudden charge. Stride and then make a melee strike. If you hit, all allies within 60 feet who saw you hit can use a reaction to stride. However, they must end their turn closer to the target of your strike than they started. This feat is incredible if you've got a lot of characters that want to be in melee. Spellcasters and archers probably won't use the reaction granted by this feat. But again, all depends on the situation. Then we finally get to that other feat I talked about when I talked about Cadence Call. Tactical Cadence. When you grant allies the quicken condition with Cadence Call, they can use the extra action to stride or strike, and they aren't slowed 1 if they decide to use the extra action. This is simply just haste, but doesn't last as long, and no downside. And remember guys that Cadence Call is 1 action, which means you can still attack twice and then use this. Or in the case of something like a bard, you can cast a spell and then use this. Cadence Call was good, but this makes it even better. And the last feat for the Marshal Archetype is Target of Opportunity. As a reaction, if an ally succeeds at a ranged attack against an opponent within their first range increment, you can make a ranged or thrown weapon attack at a -2 penalty. And this is with no multiple attack penalty. If this strike is successful, combine your damage with your ally's damage before applying weaknesses and resistances. This is more to help your allies that are ranged attackers, particularly archers, as this only works with ranged attacks. But again, not a huge fan of this feat simply because it's just more damage. However, this does help the team by getting over enemies' resistances. So it is useful in that regard. But if you don't have an archer in the party or another person using a ranged weapon, you're probably better off not picking this feat. So the Marshal Archetype will help you a lot if you have a lot of marshals in your party. Spellcasters, not so much. However, if your spellcaster is a summoning spellcaster, that's different, because summons count as allies. Therefore, the feats in the Marshal Archetype will apply to them as well. And quickening a summon can be a huge deal, as will increasing their offenses, which is another thing that the Marshal Archetype can do. But other than that, spellcasters will get the most out of the defensive options in the Marshal Archetype. But most spellcasters won't be able to take this archetype since you need to be trained in martial weapons. But if you can get a general feat before level 2 when you would take this archetype, then you can be trained in martial weapons and take the dedication. Depending, of course, on what spellcaster you are. Monks, however, will have a hard time taking this archetype since they can only be trained in certain martial weapons, and you need to be trained in all martial weapons to take this. But most other martials should be able to take this. But if you guys want to see a teamwork build for the Kingmaker campaign, you can check out this video here. Thank you guys so much for watching, and remember, teamwork is vital. It helps us solve problems.